She thought the bruises were her birthright. For 19 years, Fiona woke up to the sound of her mother screaming and went to sleep with the stinging pain of a leather strap across her back. The town of Blackwood Creek watched it happen and did nothing. They whispered that Fiona was weak, that she deserved it. But everything changed the day a massive, silent stranger rode down from the high peaks. A man who didn't believe in talking, only in action. No one knew that when he took her away, he wasn't just saving her. He was unlocking a secret that would burn her mother's world to the ground. This is the story of Fiona and Silas. The mud in Blackwood Creek was thick enough to swallow a boot hole, but Fiona didn't have boots. She had thin, cracked leather shoes that leaked freezing water with every step she took toward the water pump. "Faster, you useless girl! The guests are waiting on their coffee!" The shriek came from the porch of the Miller boarding house. Beatrice Miller stood there, hands on her wide hips, her face twisted into a permanent scowl. She was a woman who was respected in church on Sundays and feared by everyone else the rest of the week. But no one feared her more than her daughter, Fiona. Fiona, 19 years old but looking far frailer, hauled the heavy wooden bucket up. Her arms trembled. She was beautiful, though she did her best to hide it under rags and dirt, knowing that looking pretty only earned her harder slaps. "I'm coming, Mother," Fiona whispered, her voice hoarse. As she stepped onto the porch, she tripped on a plank. The water sloshed out, soaking the hem of Beatrice's pristine dress. The silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. Beatrice didn't yell. She smiled, a cold, reptilian smile that made Fiona's blood freeze. Without a word, Beatrice reached for the heavy iron ladle hanging by the door. Whack! The metal struck Fiona's shoulder with a sickening thud. Fiona gasped, dropping the bucket entirely, collapsing to her knees. "Clumsy!" Beatrice hissed, leaning down. "Stupid! You ruined my dress. That's 10 lashes tonight, Fiona. One for every $1 this dress cost. Please, Mother," Fiona begged, clutching her shoulder. "I'll clean it. I'll scrub it until it's new." "You will," Beatrice said, kicking Fiona in the ribs, sending her sprawling into the spilled water. "And then you'll sleep in the stable. You don't deserve a bed tonight." A group of miners walked by, averting their eyes. This was the way of Blackwood Creek. Beatrice Miller owned the only decent boarding house and held the debt on half the town's supplies. No one interfered with how she disciplined her dim-witted daughter. Fiona lay in the mud, tears mixing with the grime on her face. She looked up at the gray sky, wishing, not for the first time, that the fever that took her father years ago had taken her too. She had no idea that eyes were watching her, not from the town, but from the shadow of the tree line. The bell above the door of the general store chimed. The conversation inside died instantly. The man who entered had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He was massive, wearing a coat made of bear fur that still smelled of pine and old blood. A long hunting knife was strapped to his thigh, and a Winchester rifle was slung over his back. His beard was thick and dark, hiding half his face, but his eyes were visible, steel gray and sharp as flint. This was Silas. No last name. He came down from the high Bitterroot Mountains only twice a year to trade furs for flour, coffee, and ammunition. Josiah, the storekeep, swallowed hard. "Morning, Silas." "The usual?" Silas didn't speak. He just nodded, placing a heavy sack of beaver pelts on the counter. It was worth more than most men in town made in a year. As Josiah weighed the furs, the door opened again. Beatrice Miller stormed in, dragging Fiona by the ear. "I need lye soap, Josiah," Beatrice announced, ignoring the giant mountain man. "And a new scrub brush." This girl broke the last one with her laziness. Fiona was weeping silently, her ear bright red where Beatrice gripped it. She kept her head down, shame burning her cheeks. She bumped into the edge of the counter, knocking a jar of penny candy onto the floor. It shattered. "You clumsy little wretch!" Beatrice shrieked. She raised her hand, backhanding Fiona across the face with enough force to split her lip. Fiona fell back, crashing into the legs of the mountain man. She flinched, terrified he would kick her. Instead, she felt a large, gloved hand grasp her arm, not roughly, but firmly, steadying her. Fiona looked up. She was staring directly into the steel-gray eyes of Silas. For a moment, time stopped. He wasn't looking at her with disgust. He was looking at her with something she had never seen before. Recognition. "Get away from him!" Beatrice lunged forward to grab Fiona. Silas moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for a man of his size. He stepped between the women, his chest acting as a wall. Beatrice pulled up short, staring up at the giant. "Move, you savage," Beatrice spat. "That is my daughter, and I will discipline her as I see fit." Silas didn't move. His voice, when he finally spoke, was like grinding stones deep underground. "She's bleeding," Silas said. "She's clumsy," Beatrice countered. "She needs to learn." "She's learned enough pain," Silas rumbled. He looked at Josiah, then back to Beatrice. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the counter. The sound of gold coins clinking together echoed in the silent store. "I need a wife," Silas said. The words were simple, but they sucked the air out of the room. Beatrice blinked. Her greed instantly warred with her cruelty. She looked at the pouch, then at Fiona, who was trembling behind the mountain man. "You want her?" Beatrice laughed, a harsh, cackling sound. "She's useless. Can't cook without burning it. Can't clean without breaking things. She's damaged goods." $500, Silas said. The store went deadly silent. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to build a new hotel. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She looked at Fiona with pure calculation. She didn't see a daughter. She saw a payday. "Take her," Beatrice sneered. "But don't bring her back when you realize she's worthless. Once she's gone, she's dead to me." Silas didn't look at Beatrice again. He turned to Fiona, extending that large hand. "Come," he said softly. Fiona looked at her mother, then at the stranger. She knew going with him might mean death in the mountains, but staying here meant a slow death of the soul. She took his hand. The journey up the mountain was grueling, but for the first time in her life, Fiona wasn't cold. Silas had wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and placed her on his mule, traversing the steep, snowy paths on foot himself. They didn't speak for 2 days. Fiona was terrified. She had heard stories of mountain men, that they were savages, that they ate raw meat and treated women like livestock. On the third night, they made camp under a rocky overhang. Silas built a fire, the flames dancing against the snow. He cooked a rabbit, seasoning it with dried herbs from his pack. He handed her a tin plate. "Eat." Fiona took it, her hands shaking. "Thank you, sir." Silas sat across from her, his rifle. "Name is Silas. I'm Fiona. I know," he said. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you run?" Fiona paused, a piece of meat halfway to her mouth. "Run where? The winter would kill me. Or the wolves. And if the sheriff found me, he'd just drag me back to her." Silas grunted. "Sheriff Alden, a man with pockets deeper than his conscience. You know him?" "I know his type," Silas said darkly. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the scar on his cheek. "You aren't a servant anymore, Fiona. Up here, you don't serve anyone. We survive together, or we die together. Do you understand?" Fiona nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "Why did you do it? Why did you pay so much for me?" Silas looked away, staring into the dark timberline. "Because I saw a flower trying to grow in a cellar. It needed sunlight." For the next 3 months, Fiona's life transformed. It was hard work, chopping wood, hauling water from the frozen creek, learning to shoot a rifle. But it was honest work. Silas never raised a hand to her. He never yelled. If she dropped a plate, he simply picked it up. She began to fill out. The dark circles under her eyes vanished. Her hair, once dull and matted, shone like spun gold. And she began to realize that Silas, this terrifying giant, was the gentlest soul she had ever met. He would carve small wooden birds for her in the evenings. He taught her hack elk. One evening, as the snow began to melt into spring, Silas returned from checking traps with a strange look on his face. He was holding a crumpled piece of paper. "I went down to the trading post at the base of the pass," Silas said, his voice tense. "I found this tacked to a tree." He handed it to her. It was a wanted poster. Wanted FOR, theft and murder, Silas Thorne. Wanted dead or alive. Reward, $1,000. Fiona gasped. "Murder? Silas? Is this true?" "No," he said firmly. "But the name at the bottom. Look who issued the bounty." Fiona looked. Authorized by Beatrice Miller and Sheriff Alden. "My mother?" Fiona whispered. "Why would she put a bounty on you? She sold me to you. She didn't just sell you, Fiona, Silas said, pulling a leather-bound book from his coat. While I was at the post, I met an old friend who works at the county clerk's office. He gave me this. It's the original deed to the land Blackwood Creek sits on. Fiona opened the book. The name on the deed wasn't Beatrice Miller. It was William Sterling. My father, Fiona breathed. He was a drunk. He died with nothing. That's the lie she told you, Silas said, his eyes burning with anger. Your father discovered the silver lode that runs under the town. He owned it all. Beatrice was just his housekeeper. When he died, she took the deed, hid it, and raised you as a slave so you'd never know the richest woman in the territory. The realization hit Fiona like a physical blow. The beatings, the cruelty. It wasn't just hatred, it was fear. Beatrice had to keep Fiona broken so she would never ask questions. She knows, Silas said, checking his rifle. She knows I've been asking questions, and now she's coming. As if on cue, a gunshot echoed through the valley. A bullet splintered the wood of the doorframe, inches from Fiona's head. Silas tackled her to the ground, covering her body with his. Stay down. Outside, the sound of galloping horses filled the air. Beatrice hadn't just come for her daughter. She had come to bury the truth. Silas kicked the heavy oak table onto its side, shoving Fiona behind it just as a volley of bullets shredded the front windows. Glass exploded inward, shards glittering like deadly diamonds in the firelight. Stay low, Silas growled, sliding his Winchester rifle toward her across the floorboards. He kept his own hunting rifle tight against his shoulder, peering through a chink in the cabin logs. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you shoot them. Center mass. Don't hesitate. Fiona's hands shook so violently she could barely grip the cold metal of the Winchester. This wasn't shooting at stationary tree stumps. This was her mother out there. Silas Thorne, come out and face justice! The voice belonged to Sheriff Alden. It echoed off the canyon walls, slick with false righteousness. Justice? Silas roared back, his deep as a bear's growl. You wouldn't know justice if it hanged you, Alden. You're trespassing on Sterling land. A moment of silence outside confirmed that the sheriff knew Silas had the deed. Then, Beatrice's shriek cut through the cold air. Burn them out! Burn the rats! Silas cursed under his breath. They brought torches. He moved to the back window. Silas was a different man now. The quiet contemplation was gone, replaced by a lethal, focused energy. He raised his rifle, took a breath, and fired. A scream outside cut short. One down, he muttered, cycling the lever action. 4 left, counting Alden and your mother. Beatrice had hired 3 hard cases from down in the valley, men who killed for whiskey money. They were spreading out, trying to flank the cabin. Silas moved from window to window, a ghost in the dim light. He fired again, clipping another man in the shoulder, sending him spinning into a snowbank. But they were getting closer. A heavy thud against the front door made Fiona jump. Someone was trying to ram it open. Watch the door! Silas yelled as he moved to the side of the cabin where smoke was beginning to curl under the eaves. They had lit the woodpile against the wall. Fiona leveled the heavy Winchester at the door. The wood groaned. The hinges screamed. She thought of the beatings, the years of cold soup and sleeping on straw. She thought of the father she never knew, robbed by the woman outside. The door splintered open. A man with a red bandana over his face burst in, a shotgun in his hands. He saw Silas first and raised the weapon. Fiona didn't think. She didn't breathe. She just squeezed the trigger the way Silas had taught her. The Winchester roared, kicking hard against her shoulder. The man in the doorway jerked backward as if yanked by an invisible rope, collapsing onto the porch. Silas looked back at her, a flicker of fierce pride in his gray eyes. Good girl. Now we move? Move? Where? Fiona choked out, the smoke starting to sting her eyes. The back wall was catching fire fast. Out the back trap door to the root cellar. It leads to the creek bed. We have to make for the high timber. It's the only way. But the snow, it's too deep without the mule. We aren't taking the mule, Silas said, grabbing his pack and stuffing the deed inside his coat. We run, Fiona. We run for our lives. They dropped into the darkness of the root cellar just as the roof of the cabin began to cave in, showering the interior with sparks. Above them, they heard Beatrice screaming in frustration as she realized her prey had slipped the trap. The trap door to the root cellar groaned under the immense heat of the collapsing cabin above. Sparks rained down through the cracks in the floorboards like hellfire, singing Fiona's hair as Silas shoved her into the damp, earthen darkness. "Move," Silas coughed, the smoke already thick enough to taste. "Don't stop until you feel wind on your face." They scrambled through the narrow escape tunnel Silas had dug for this exact purpose. A bolt hole for a man who knew he could never truly trust civilization. The tunnel was tight, smelling of wet clay and rotting potatoes. Fiona crawled on her hands and knees, the terror of the burning cabin behind her pushing her forward. They burst out into the night air near the frozen creek bed, gasping like drowning swimmers breaking the surface. The contrast was physically painful. Behind them, the cabin was a roaring pyre, casting a violent orange glow against the black timber. The heat was intense, but the air hitting their lungs was 10 degrees below zero. "My mother," Fiona wheezed, looking back at the inferno. "She'll think we burned." "She won't," Silas said grimly. He was checking the snow at their feet. "Alden is a tracker. A bad one, but good enough to see boot prints in fresh powder. We have a head start of maybe 10 minutes. Up. We go up." The ascent was a nightmare that Fiona would relive for the rest of her life. They bypassed the trail. It was too exposed, and cut straight up the spine of the mountain toward the jagged peaks that tore at the moonlit sky. The snow here wasn't the soft, powdery dust of the valley. It was a hard, crusty layer over feet of loose drift. With every step, Fiona broke through the crust, sinking to her thigh. The ice tore at her skirts and scrapped her shins raw. Her breath came in short, jagged clouds. Silas, moving with the relentless drive of a machine, broke the path ahead. He was a massive shadow against the snow, his bare fur coat making him look like a beast of the mountain. But Fiona could hear his breathing too, heavy, labored. He was carrying 50 pounds of gear, the heavy Winchester, and the weight of their survival. An hour passed, then 2. The cold began to seep into Fiona's bones, a numbness that started in her toes and worked its way up, whispering to her that it would be so easy to just lie down and sleep. "Don't look at the snow." Silas's voice cut through the wind, sharp and commanding. He had paused, waiting for her to catch up. He grabbed her chin with a gloved hand, forcing her to look at him. "Look at me. Keep your eyes on my back. If you stop, you die. Do you understand?" I can't feel my feet, Silas." "You will when we get to the pass," he promised, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. He turned to look down into the valley. Fiona followed his gaze and felt her heart stop. Far below, weaving through the tree line like a fiery snake, were torches. 3 distinct lights, and they were moving fast, much faster than Fiona and Silas were. "How?" Fiona whispered, terror spiking her adrenaline. "How are they moving so fast?" "Snowshoes," Silas spat the word like a curse. "I should have known Alden would have them in his saddlebags. They're gliding over the crust while we're fighting through it." The gap was closing. The men weren't shouting anymore. They were hunting in silence, fueled by the promise of the silver load and the hatred burning in Beatrice's heart. Silas scanned the terrain. They were just below the timberline, entering a vast, open bowl of snow known to the locals as the Devil's Anvil. It was a massive, steep slope of unstable shale and ice, crowned by a heavy cornice of wind-blown snow that hung over the edge like a frozen wave about to break. To cross, it meant exposure. To stay meant capture. "We can't outrun them," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He looked at the Winchester in his hand, then up at the hanging shelf of snow 500 feet above them. He did the math of a mountain man who knew the physics of death. He turned to Fiona. The look on his face was one she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the stoic protector or the gentle teacher. It was the look of a man saying goodbye. "Fiona," he said, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was hard, bruising. "Listen to me closely. See that rock outcrop? The black granite sticking out of the slope about 50 yards to the east?" Fiona nodded, her teeth chattering. "Yes. Run to it. Wedge yourself into the deepest crevice you can find. Cover your head. Cover your ears. And no matter what you hear, do not come out until the world stops moving." "What are you going to do?" Fiona grabbed his coat, panic rising in her chest. "You're coming with me!" "I have to draw them out," Silas lied. But it was a bad lie. "Go, now! If you want to live, run!" He shoved hard. Fiona stumbled, then scrambled toward the rocks. She didn't look back until she had wedged herself between two massive slabs of granite, the stone biting into her back. From her hiding spot, she watched Silas. He didn't follow her. He walked out into the center of the Devil's Anvil. He stood there, a solitary dark figure against the blinding white, illuminated by the full moon. He unslung his rifle and waited. 10 minutes later, the torches crested the ridge below. Sheriff Alden was in the lead, his face wrapped in a scarf. Beatrice was right behind him, struggling in borrowed snowshoes but driven by a manic energy. A hired gun brought up the rear. They saw Silas standing exposed in the moonlight and stopped. "End of the line! Mountain Man!" Alden's voice carried eerily well in the thin, cold air. He raised his repeater rifle. Beatrice pushed past him, her face twisted in a rictus of triumph. "Where is she? Where is the little wretch?" "Gone!" Silas boomed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I sent her over the pass. You'll never catch her." "Liar!" Beatrice shrieked. "She's freezing and weak! Kill him! Alden! Kill him and we'll track her footprints!" Alden leveled his rifle. "Drop the gun, Silas, or I'll gut you right here." Silas didn't drop the gun. He raised the Winchester. But he didn't aim at Alden. He didn't aim at Beatrice. He aimed the barrel almost straight up, toward the massive, overhanging cornice of snow hanging precariously above the slope. Alden frowned, confused. "What the hell are you?" Silas fired. Crack. The sound of the high-caliber round was deafening in the bowl. Silas didn't wait. He levered the action and fired again. Crack. And a third time. Crack. The echo of the shot slammed back and forth between the mountains. Then a deeper sound began. A low, guttural groan, like the earth itself was waking up in pain. Beatrice looked up, her mouth falling open. The cornice shattered. A block of hard-packed snow the size of a church broke free from the peak. It hit the slope below with a thud that shook the ground under Fiona's feet. Then the mountain dissolved. "Run!" Alden screamed, turning clumsily in his snowshoes. But you cannot run from the White Death. The avalanche gathered speed instantly, transforming from a slide into a tidal wave of churning ice, rock, and powdered snow. It moved at 100 miles an hour, a roaring white beast that swallowed the sound of the wind, the screams of the men, and the shrieks of Beatrice Miller. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut and clamped her hands over her ears, burying her face in her knees. The sound was a physical weight pressing against her skull. The ground shook violently, threatening to dislodge her from the rocks. The air filled with a fine, choking powder that coated her throat. It sounded like a freight train driving directly through her head. The went on for an eternity. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute of pure, unadulterated violence. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Fiona waited, counting to 10, before she dared to open her eyes. She crawled out of the crevice, shaking the snow from her shoulders. The landscape had changed. The Devil's Anvil was gone. The slope had been scoured clean down to the bedrock, and the valley floor below was buried under 50 feet of debris. There were no torches. There was no shouts. There was no Beatrice. Fiona's eyes frantically scanned the ridge where Silas had stood. "Silas?" she croaked. The ridge was empty. The spot where he had made his stand was gone, swept away into the white abyss below. "Silas!" she screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. Only the wind answered. The silence that followed the avalanche was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrified. It felt as though the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if anything had survived its wrath. Fiona stood on the edge of the scoured bedrock, her chest heaving, staring down into the white abyss where the man who had saved her had just vanished. "Silas?" Her voice was a broken croak, instantly swallowed by the vastness of the peaks. Panic, colder than the biting wind, seized her heart. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk of a secondary slide, stability of the snow. She simply moved. Fiona scrambled down the side of the devastation, sliding uncontrollably over loose shale and chunks of ice as big as anvils. Sharp rocks tore at her skirts and sliced her palms, but she couldn't feel the pain. The adrenaline coursing through her veins had turned her into a creature of pure instinct. She reached the debris field, a chaotic jumble of uprooted pine trees, boulders, and packed snow that stretched for half a mile. It looked like a graveyard. "Silas!" she screamed again, dropping to her knees and clawing at a mound of snow that looked disturbingly like a human shape. It was just a broken branch. She moved to the next mound. Nothing. And the next. Tears froze instantly on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. "Don't take him. Take me, but not him. He's the only good thing in this world." She searched for 20 minutes, her hands turning blue, her movements becoming frantic and clumsy. She was about to collapse from exhaustion when she saw it. A splash of dark brown against the relentless white, 50 yards down the slope near a cluster of snapped saplings. It was the bear fur coat. Fiona lunged forward, falling, crawling, dragging herself through the snow until she reached him. Silas was half buried, his massive body crumpled against the trunk of a fallen pine that had likely stopped him from being swept over the cliff edge further down. He was face down. The snow around his head was bright, shocking crimson. "No, no, no." Fiona whimpered, frantically digging the packed ice away from his body. Her fingernails broke, her fingers bled, but she dug until she could roll him over. His face was a mask of blood from a deep gash on his forehead, and his skin was terrifyingly pale, possessing the waxen quality of the dead. Fiona ripped the glove off her hand and pressed her fingers to his neck. For a second, she felt nothing, and her own heart stopped. Then she felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, and slow, but there. "Silas, wake up!" She slapped his cheeks, rubbing handfuls of snow against his face to shock him. He didn't stir. Fiona looked down at his body and gasped. His right leg was twisted at a grotesque, unnatural angle, the tibia clearly shattered beneath the heavy canvas of his trousers. The avalanche had broken him. She knew she couldn't carry him. He outweighed her by 100 pounds. But she also knew that if they stayed here, the cold would finish what the snow had started. They needed shelter. "I am not leaving you," she gritted out, her voice finding a steel edge she didn't know it possessed. She grabbed the collar of his coat and pulled. He didn't budge. She dug her heels into the snow, screaming with effort, and pulled again. He moved an inch. "Come on!" she shrieked at the mountain. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, toward a dense thicket of spruce trees that had survived the slide on the far edge of the slope. For an hour to move him 50 yards. By the time they reached the shelter of the trees, Fiona was exhausted, her lungs burning like they were filled with broken glass. She collapsed beside him, panting. As the adrenaline faded, the cold rushed back in, violent and biting. Silas groaned. Fiona scrambled to his head. "Silas? Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, revealing steel-gray eyes that were hazy and unfocused. He tried to take a breath and coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Fiona." His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "You alive? I'm here. We're safe. We're in the trees." He tried to sit up, and a guttural roar of pain ripped from his throat. His head fell back, his teeth clenched so hard she thought they might crack. "Leg, it's broken," Fiona said, her hands hovering over him, terrified to cause more pain, but knowing she had to act. "I have to splint it, Silas. If we move again, the bone could cut the artery." "Do it," he wheezed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Do it fast." Fiona found 2 straight, sturdy branches snapped off by the avalanche. She reached under her skirt and tore her petticoat, the only clean fabric she had, into long strips. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, tears welling up again. "Just tie it tight," Silas gritted out. He shoved a piece of leather strap from his gear with his teeth. Fiona took a breath and set the bone. Silas didn't scream. He made a sound low in his throat, a primal noise of agony, and his back arched off the snow. Then he went limp, passing out from the pain. Fiona worked quickly, tying the branches tight to his leg. When she was done, she collapsed back against the tree, trembling uncontrollably. She covered him with loose pine boughs to trap his body heat and huddled next to him, sharing her own warmth. They lay there for hours as the moon began to dip toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of ghostly blue. Fiona kept vigil, watching the rise and fall of his chest, willing him to keep breathing. Just before dawn, the wind shifted. It brought a sound that made the hair on Fiona's arms stand up. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a wet, bubbling cough followed by a moan. It was coming from the edge of the tree line, back toward the slide zone. Fiona grabbed Silas's hunting knife from his belt. She stood up, her legs stiff and aching, and crept toward the sound. She expected a wolf, or perhaps one of the hired gunmen. She saw a dark shape protruding from a snowbank about 30 feet away. It was a boot, a fine, leather riding boot with a silver spur. Fiona approached cautiously, the knife held out in front of her. She brushed the snow away from the figure's face. It was Sheriff Alden. The mountain had not been kind to him. He had been tumbled and crushed by the debris. His chest was caved in on one side, his breathing a jagged, wheezing struggle. His skin was the color of old ash, and his lips were blue. He opened his eyes. They were glassy, fixed on the sky, until Fiona blocked his view. He focused on her, confused at first, then recognizing her. "The girl," he whispered. A bubble of blood formed at the corner of his mouth. "Where is she?" Fiona demanded, her voice void of pity. "Where is Beatrice?" Alden tried to laugh, but it turned into a hacking cough that racked his broken body. "Gone. Saw her go under. Deep. She's dead, girl." The devil finally came for his bride. Fiona stared at him. The man who had turned a blind eye to her bruises for years. The man who had eaten at their table while she starved in the kitchen. "Why?" Fiona asked, the question that had burned in her soul for a decade. "Why did you let her do it? You're the law." Alden's eyes drifted closed, then snapped open as a spasm of pain hit him. He looked at Fiona with a sudden, desperate clarity, the look of a man who sees the gates of hell opening and wants to lighten his soul before he steps through. "Money," Alden rasped. "She promised me. Half. Half of what? The boarding house?" "No," Alden wheezed. "The silver. The load." Fiona froze. "What silver? The land," Alden whispered, his voice fading. "Your father." He didn't die of fever. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind stopped. The cold vanished, replaced by a hot, sick feeling in Fiona's stomach. "What are you saying?" she hissed, leaning closer, the knife trembling in her hand. "He found it," Alden said, staring past her now. Massive vein of silver, running right under the creek. He was going to register the claim, make you a princess. Beatrice found out. She poisoned his whiskey. Rat poison. Fiona recoiled as if he had slapped her. "Murdered? I was deputy then," Alden confessed, tears leaking from his eyes. "I found the body, saw the cup, saw the empty vial. She told me if I kept quiet, she'd make me sheriff. Said we'd rule this town. She took the deed, hid it, kept you beaten down so you'd never remember who you were. If you were weak, you wouldn't ask questions." Fiona stood up slowly. The pieces of her shattered life suddenly fit together. The cruelty wasn't just madness. It was calculation. Every slap, every insult, every night in the stable. It was all designed to break her spirit so she wouldn't claim her birthright. They hadn't just stolen her childhood. They had stolen her father's life. Alden reached out a trembling hand, grasping the hem of her tattered dress. I can feel the fire, Fiona. It's hot. Tell the priest. He gasped, his eyes widening in terror at something only he could see. Then he let out a long, rattling breath, and his hand fell limp into the snow. Sheriff Alden was dead. Fiona stood over the corpse of the man who had sold her life for silver. She expected to feel sadness, or perhaps relief. But she felt neither. Inside the chest of the girl who used to cry when she spilled water, something hardened. The fear burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline rage. She looked down at the knife in her hand. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. She was a Sterling. She turned her back on the dead man and looked toward the trees where Silas lay. "Silas," she whispered to the wind. "We're going home." She walked back to him, her stride stronger now. She knelt beside him and checked his forehead. He was burning up with fever, but he was alive. Fiona looked down the mountain, toward the valley hidden in the morning mist, toward Blackwood Creek. "Rest now, Silas," she said softly, brushing the hair from his eyes. "Because when you wake up, we're going to take back everything they stole." The descent from the high peaks was a funeral march of two. It took them 3 agonizing days to limp down from the timberline. They moved like wounded ghosts, leaving a trail of blood and drag marks in the thawing mud. Fiona bore the brunt of the weight. Silas, a man who had once carried elk carcasses across his shoulders without breaking a sweat, was now to leaning heavily on the girl he had bought for $500. His splinted leg dragged uselessly behind him, every step a fresh torture that turned his face a sickly shade of gray. But he refused to stop. He refused to die before he saw it finished. By the time the muddy thoroughfare of Blackwood Creek came into view, the sun was high and harsh. The town was waking up to a Tuesday bustle, unaware that the hierarchy of their world was about to be shattered. They didn't sneak in. They didn't hide in the alleys. They walked right down the center of Main Street. The first person to see them was Old Man Abernathy, the blacksmith. He dropped his hammer on the anvil, the clang ringing out like a church bell. Then the baker stopped kneading dough in the window. The saloon doors swung open, and patrons stumbled out, blinking in the light. A hush fell over Blackwood Creek. It was a silence born of shock and superstitious fear. To them, Fiona and Silas were dead, swallowed by the avalanche that had claimed the sheriff. Yet here they were, the giant mountain man, battered and broken, supported by the frail girl who had transformed into something unrecognizable. Fiona's hair was matted with pine sap and dried blood. Her face was wind-burned, her lips cracked, but her eyes were clear. There was no fear in them anymore. The girl who used to flinch at the sound of a dropped spoon was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the freezing dark. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office. A crowd had formed, a tight circle of whispering, frightened faces. Deputy Higgins stepped out onto the boardwalk, his hands hovering nervously near his gun belt. He looked at the giant with the broken leg, then at the girl wearing the oversized bear fur coat. "Silas? Fiona?" Higgins stammered, his voice cracking. We saw the slide. We thought you were all dead. Where is Sheriff Alden? Where is Mrs. Miller?" Fiona gently eased Silas down so he could lean against the water trough. She straightened up, looking Higgins dead in the eye. "Sheriff Alden is dead," Fiona announced. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the crowd, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. The mountain took him, just like it took the lies this town was built on. Dead? Higgins went pale. "And your mother?" "Beatrice Miller isn't my mother," Fiona said, her voice dripping with ice. "She is my father's murderer." A gasp ripped through the crowd. The accusation was too big, too horrifying to process immediately. "That's a hanging offense to say, girl," the blacksmith grumbled from the front row. "You best be careful." Fiona reached into the deep pocket of the greatcoat. She didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out the leather-bound book Silas had retrieved from the county clerk. She held it up, the gold leaf on the cover catching the sun. "For 19 years, Fiona said, turning to face the townspeople who had watched her suffer. "You let her beat me. You let her treat me like a dog. You looked away because you owed her money. You looked away because you were afraid." She opened the book to the deed, the pages crinkling in the silence. "Beatrice Miller owns nothing. She was a housekeeper who poisoned William Sterling, my father, to steal the silver lode that runs under this very street. Sheriff Alden confessed to it with his dying breath." "Liar!" The scream didn't come from the crowd. It came from the alleyway beside the general store. The crowd parted violently, people tripping over themselves to get out of the way. Stumbling out of the shadows was a creature that barely resembled a human being. It was Beatrice. She had survived the avalanche, but the mountain had exacted a terrible price. Her fine silk dress was shredded to rags, revealing skin purple with deep bruising. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, the shoulder dislocated. Her face was a mask of dried blood and madness, her hair wild and white with frost. She looked like a demon crawled up from the pit. She hadn't returned to town to confess. She had returned to scavenge what was left of her empire. "She's a liar!" Beatrice shrieked, pointing a trembling, claw-like finger at Fiona. She limped into the circle, her eyes darting around frantically. "That savage kidnapped her. They killed the sheriff. Arrest them. Higgins! Do your job, you coward! Hang them both!" Higgins looked from the battered, demonic woman to the calm, resolute daughter holding the book of truth. The deed in Fiona's hand, then at the madness in Beatrice's eyes. He didn't move toward his gun. The deed is signed by William Sterling, Beatrice, Higgins said quietly. And Fiona is his only kin. I am the law here, Beatrice screamed, spitting blood. I own you! I own all of you! Seeing that her words held no power anymore, Beatrice's eyes snapped to Fiona. Pure, unadulterated hatred flooded her expression. If she couldn't own the fortune, no one would. With a speed born of desperation, Beatrice reached into the ruins of her bodice and pulled out a small, pearl-handled derringer. It's mine, she wailed. She raised the gun, aiming directly at Fiona's heart. The crowd screamed. Fiona stood her ground, unflinching, accepting her fate. But Silas did not accept it. Despite his shattered leg, despite the fever burning in his blood, the mountain man moved. He didn't try to walk. He lunged, using the water trough as leverage to swing his body forward. He swung the heavy walnut stock of his Winchester rifle like a club. Crack. The wood connected with Beatrice's wrist just as the gun went off. The bullet went wide, burying itself harmlessly in the dirt. Beatrice howled, a sound less like a woman and more like a wounded animal. As the derringer flew from her shattered hand, she collapsed into the mud, clutching her wrist, sobbing hysterically. The silence that returned was absolute. Fiona over to where her tormentor lay. She looked down at the woman who had made her sleep in a stable, who had beaten her for spilling water, who had stolen her life. Beatrice looked up, her face streaked with mud and tears. The madness flickered out, replaced by a sudden, pathetic begging. Fiona? Beatrice whimpered, reaching out with her good hand to grasp the hem of the bear fur coat. Fiona, baby, please, I raised you. I gave you a roof. I'm your mother. Fiona looked at the hand grasping her coat. She didn't kick it away. She simply stepped back, severing the contact. You gave me scars, Fiona said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet street. You gave me nothing but pain, and you are not my mother. You are just a thief who stayed too long. Fiona turned to Deputy Higgins, who was staring, open-mouthed. She handed him the leather book. Then, she walked over to the mud and picked up the pearl-handled derringer. She handed that to him, too. Arrest her, Fiona ordered, for the murder of William Sterling, and for the attempted murder of myself. Higgins nodded slowly, as if waking from a dream. He unhooked the iron cuffs from his belt. Yes, ma'am, I believe I will. 2 men from the town, the same men who had once ignored Fiona's tears, stepped forward to help the deputy. They hauled the screaming, thrashing Beatrice to her feet. As they dragged her toward the jailhouse, her threats turned to wails, waiting until the heavy iron door slammed shut with a finality that rang through the valley. Fiona felt a physical weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she hadn't realized was crushing her until it was gone. She took a deep, trembling breath of the cold mountain air. It tasted sweet. She turned back to the water trough. Silas was slumped there, his energy finally spent, his face pale and sweating. But his eyes were open, and they were fixed on her with a look of fierce, quiet pride. Fiona walked to him, ignoring the staring crowd. She knelt in the mud, heedless of the dress, and took his large, rough hand in hers. We did it, she whispered, tears finally spilling over, not of sadness, but of relief. It's over, Silas. Silas squeezed her hand, his grip weak but warm. He looked around at the town that was now watching them with awe and respect, then back at the woman who had saved him on the mountain just as he had saved her. No, Fiona, he rumbled, a faint smile touching his bearded lips. The hard part is over. The living, that's just beginning. The trial of Beatrice Miller was short. With the deed as proof and the testimony of the town, she was sentenced to life in the territorial prison, far away from the wealth she had killed for. She died penniless and alone 2 years later, screaming at ghosts in her cell. Fiona didn't hoard the sterling fortune. She remembered what it was like to have nothing. She used the silver wealth to build a real school in Blackwood Creek and a hospital where no one was turned away. She paid off the debts of the poorest families, freeing them from the grip Beatrice had held them in. Silas never went back to living fully in the mountains, though he and Fiona spent their summers in a new cabin they built near the timberline, far from the memories of the siege. His leg healed, though he always walked with a slight limp, a reminder of the day the mountain judged the wicked. They were married quietly in the spring, with the whole town attending. People said Fiona Sterling was the most beautiful bride the territory had ever seen, not just for her golden hair, but for the strength in her eyes. And standing beside her, the quiet mountain man who had seen a flower in a cellar and brought it into the sun, smiled for the first time anyone in Blackwood Creek could remember. They had both found the one thing they never expected, a home and a love strong enough to move mountains. What an incredible journey of survival and justice for Fiona and Silas. It just goes to show that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest strength, and karma always finds a way to collect its debts, even if it takes an avalanche to do it. If this story of Wild West retribution and unexpected love had you hooked, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What do you think Beatrice deserved in the end? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling story from the frontier. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.